The boarding call echoed through the San Diego terminal, mingling with the shuffle of rolling suitcases and the murmur of weary travelers. It was nearly midnight, the kind of red-eye flight people booked because they had to, not because they wanted to. Families ushered children who clutched stuffed animals. Business professionals in pressed suits balanced briefcases and coffee, and couples spoke in hushed tones, as if already conserving energy for the long journey ahead. Seat 8A, tucked against. The window in the forward cabin belonged to Captain Sarah Monroe tonight. Few knew her name and none knew her story as she slid quietly into her seat. To anyone else, she looked like an ordinary passenger. Dark jeans, a fitted jacket, and hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun. But beneath the civilian clothes was a woman who had logged thousands of hours in the skies as a U.S. Air Force pilot. She had flown combat missions, endured sleepless nights over desert bases, and stared death in the face more times than she could count. Tonight, though, Sarah wasn't Captain Monroe. She was simply another traveler, exhausted from weeks of non-stop training exercises. Her body ached from long days in the cockpit and longer nights debriefing crews. She had promised herself one thing when she finally buckled into 8A. She would rest. The world could carry on without her for 5 hours. She pulled her jacket tighter, let her head rest against the cool window, and surrendered to sleep. Beside her in 8B, a broad-shouldered man lowered himself into his seat with practiced ease. Commander Jack Riley, Navy SEAL, had just completed his latest deployment, one that had taken him halfway around the world and back through shadows no one spoke of in public. To strangers, he looked like a man who carried his bulk with quiet confidence. To those who knew better, his presence radiated discipline, the type that came from years of missions where a single mistake could mean death. Jack had seen Sarah during boarding, noting the sharpness in her posture even as exhaustion softened her face. They exchanged a polite greeting, the way strangers do, but something in her eyes, that quick assessing glance, told him she was military too. He didn't pry. She didn't volunteer more. Two warriors side by side, both too tired to talk. As the engines roared to life, Sarah barely stirred. The vibration of takeoff, the tilt as the plane clawed into the sky, all of it blended into the haze of her dreams. Jack, on the other hand, stayed awake. He always stayed awake. Years of conditioning meant he rarely slept on flights, especially commercial ones. His mind refused to shut down in confined spaces filled with strangers. He watched the cabin settle after the climb. Overhead bins clicked shut, seatbelt signs chimed, and attendants moved with quiet efficiency. Most passengers pulled out blankets or headphones, eager to disappear into their own worlds. To the average eye, it was an ordinary flight, the kind you forgot as soon as you landed. But Jack Riley's instincts didn't agree. He noticed the way one flight attendant lingered near the galley longer than necessary, whispering sharply into the phone. He noted the way another crew member glanced toward the cockpit, her lips pressed tight in a line that spoke of tension, not routine. These weren't signs of turbulence or mechanical trouble. They were subtler, quieter, but they set off the alarms in his head nonetheless. He shifted slightly in his seat, scanning the passengers. Nothing obvious stood out. A man flipping through a business magazine, a mother rocking a toddler, a group of students laughing quietly. Ordinary. Yet his gut told him otherwise. Something felt off, like the air carried a pressure no one else noticed. Beside him, Sarah exhaled softly, lost in sleep. Lost. She was utterly unaware of the storm quietly brewing around her. Jack studied her for a moment. She had the look of someone who had carried responsibility heavier than her frame should bear. He wondered if she had any idea that tonight, on this plane, her skills might matter more than any mission she had flown in uniform. He leaned back, closing his eyes only halfway, like a predator pretending to rest. The hum of the engines filled the silence, steady, deceptive. For the rest of the cabin, the night was calm. For Commander Riley, it was the beginning of something else. A puzzle he hadn't yet solved, but one he knew would demand vigilance. And in 8A, Sarah Monroe slept soundly, unaware that her rest would soon end with a jolt, a shout, and the kind of call no pilot expected to answer at 30,000 feet. Jack Riley had long ago learned that quiet could be misleading. In his world, silence was rarely peace. It was a cover, a pause before the storm. On this flight, as the cabin lights dimmed and passengers began to sink into the lull of midnight travel, his body refused to join them. His instincts, sharpened by years of special operations, were whispering, "Stay awake. Watch." The SEAL sat motionless in seat 8B, but his eyes were alive, sweeping the cabin with practiced discretion. He could read people the way some men read books. The jittery tapping of fingers, the unnatural stiffness in posture, the hushed exchanges between crew members, none of it escaped him. At first, it was small things. The lead flight attendant walked the aisle with a forced smile, her eyes darting toward the cockpit more often than necessary. Twice she leaned into the galley phone, her voice low, her shoulders tense. Another attendant adjusted the beverage cart, fumbling more than once, her hands trembling slightly. To the casual traveler, it was nothing. To Jack, it screamed distraction, maybe fear. He leaned back slightly, angling himself to appear relaxed, but his mind catalogued every detail. The exits, the strongest-looking passengers, the nervous ones who might panic, even the layout of the cabin carts, which could serve as barriers in a fight. Every scenario unfolded in his head, rehearsed and stored like flashcards. If something happens, I'll need 5 seconds to stand 7 to close the distance. Don't wait for orders, move. His gaze drifted to the woman in 8A. Sarah Monroe hadn't stirred since takeoff. Her breathing was even, her body slack in true exhaustion. She wasn't faking it. She was gone, lost to the heavy sleep only the deeply fatigued could know. He envied her, in a way. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept like that. They'd spoken briefly before boarding, a courtesy exchange while waiting in line. She had a quiet presence, polite but distant, as though conserving her words. Yet when she looked at him, he caught something familiar in her gaze. The habit of sizing up her surroundings, the way her eyes flicked to exits, scanned people, then returned to neutral. Military, no doubt about it. Maybe Air Force, maybe Army. The branches had their tells. She hadn't confirmed, but Jack didn't need words. Warriors recognized warriors. Now, as he sat with his nerves coiling tighter, he found himself glancing at her again. He wondered how fast she could wake if she needed to. Could she flip from exhaustion to clarity the way SEALs were trained to? He hoped she could, because the cabin was starting to hum with the wrong kind of energy. Behind them, a pair of men whispered to each other in a language Jack didn't immediately place. Their voices were low, conspiratorial, with an edge of urgency. One of them shifted under his seat, pulling at something. A bag? A strap? Jack's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain still. He wasn't ready to act yet, not until he was certain. The wrong move could send panic spiraling. He tried to rationalize it away. Maybe he was reading too much into nothing. Maybe the crew was simply tired. Maybe the men were just restless travelers. But deep down he knew better. His instincts had saved his life and his team's lives too many times to dismiss. The signs were all there. The tremor in the attendants' hands, the suspicious whispers, the restless movement near the front. Jack adjusted his breathing, slow and measured, centering himself for what might come. He wasn't afraid. Fear was something he'd burned out of himself long ago, but he respected danger, respected how quickly it could tip the scales from order to chaos, and he could feel it creeping closer now, minute by minute, like a tightening noose around the plane. The SEAL glanced once more at Sarah, still slumped, against the window, jacket pulled tight as if warding off the cold. She had no idea what currents were shifting around her. For now, she looked like anyone else, another anonymous passenger drifting through the night sky. Jack narrowed his eyes, his hand tightening slightly on the armrest. He didn't know her story yet, but he knew this. Before the night was over, the woman in 8A might matter more than anyone else on this plane, and when the time came, he would make sure she woke up. Jack Riley had long ago learned that quiet could be misleading. In his world, silence was rarely peace. It was a cover, a pause before the storm. On this flight, As the cabin lights dimmed and passengers began to sink into the lull of midnight, travel, his body refused to join them. His instincts, sharpened by years of special operations, were whispering, "Stay awake. Watch." The SEAL sat motionless in seat 8B, but his eyes were alive, sweeping the cabin with practiced discretion. He could read people the way some men read books. The jittery tapping of fingers, the unnatural stiffness in posture, the hushed exchanges between crew members. None of it escaped him. At first, it was small things. The lead flight attendant walked the aisle with a forced smile, her eyes darting toward the cockpit more often than necessary. Twice she leaned into the galley phone, her voice low, her shoulders tense. Another attendant adjusted the beverage cart, fumbling more than once, her hands trembling slightly. To the casual traveler, it was nothing. To Jack, it screamed distraction, maybe fear. He leaned back slightly, angling himself to appear relaxed, but his mind catalogued every detail. The exits, the strongest-looking passengers, the nervous ones who might panic. Even the layout of the cabin carts, which could serve as barriers in a fight. Every scenario unfolded in his head, rehearsed and stored like flashcards. If something happens, I'll need 5 seconds to stand. 7 to close the distance. Don't wait for orders. Move. His gaze drifted to the woman in 8A. Sarah Monroe hadn't stirred since takeoff. Her breathing was even, her body slack in, true exhaustion. She wasn't faking it, she was gone, lost to the heavy sleep only the deeply fatigued could know. He envied her in a way. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept like that. They'd spoken briefly before boarding, a courtesy exchange while waiting in line. She had a quiet presence, polite but distant, as though conserving her words. Yet when she looked at him, he caught something familiar in her gaze. The habit of sizing up her surroundings, the way her eyes flicked to exits, scanned people, then returned to neutral. Military, no doubt about it. Maybe Air Force, maybe Army. The branches had their tells. She hadn't confirmed, but Jack didn't need words. Warriors recognized warriors. Now, as he sat with his nerves coiling tighter, he found himself glancing at her again. He wondered how fast she could wake if she needed to. Could she flip from exhaustion to clarity the way SEALs were trained to? He hoped she could, because the cabin was starting to hum with the wrong kind of energy. Behind them, a pair of men whispered to each other in a language Jack didn't immediately place. Their voices were low, conspiratorial, with an edge of urgency. One of them shifted under his seat, pulling at something. A bag? A strap? Jack's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain still. He wasn't ready to act yet, not until he was certain. The wrong move could send panic spiraling. He tried to rationalize it away. Maybe he was reading too much into nothing. Maybe the crew was simply tired. Maybe the men were just restless travelers. But deep down, he knew better. His instincts had saved his life and his team's lives too many times to dismiss. The signs were all there. The tremor in the attendants, hands, the suspicious whispers, the restless movement near the front. Jack adjusted his breathing, slow and measured, centering himself for what might come. He wasn't afraid. Fear was something he'd burned out of himself long ago. But he respected danger, respected how quickly it could tip the scales from order to chaos. And he could feel it creeping closer now, minute by minute, like a tightening noose around the plane. The SEAL glanced once more at Sarah, still slumped, against the window, jacket pulled tight as if warding off the cold. She had no idea what currents were shifting around her. For now, she looked like anyone else, another anonymous passenger drifting through the night sky. Jack narrowed his eyes, his hand tightening slightly on the armrest. He didn't know her story yet, but he knew this. Before the night was over, the woman in 8A might matter more than anyone else on this plane, and when the time came, he would make sure she woke up. Sarah Monroe was deep in the kind of sleep that wrapped itself around the body like chains. For days she had run on fumes, flying back-to-back missions and attending briefings until her eyelids burned. In seat 8A, the dim hum of the engines had lulled her into surrender, And for the first time in weeks, her mind allowed itself silence, until a rough hand shook her shoulder. Her eyes blinked open, foggy and unfocused. The first thing she registered was the grip, strong, deliberate, unyielding. Then came the voice, low and commanding, slicing through her grogginess like a blade. "Wake up, pilot." Her mind snapped awake in an instant. Those words, "pilot," hit like a switch. She inhaled sharply, her chest rising as adrenaline flushed away the fog of sleep. Years of training had taught her to go, from zero to combat ready in seconds. And though she was out of uniform, instinct took over. Sarah sat upright, eyes scanning rapidly. It took her less than a heartbeat to see what was happening. Two men were at the cockpit door, fists pounding, voices barking orders in a harsh, guttural rhythm. A flight attendant was on the floor, cradling, her wrist, her face pale with shock. The passengers sat frozen, wide-eyed, their fear suffocating the air. Sarah's gaze darted to the man beside her, Jack Riley, his hand still on her shoulder, eyes locked on hers with grim certainty. He didn't waste words, but she understood everything in that look. This is real. It's happening now. "Status," she whispered, voice already steady, controlled. "Two confirmed," he murmured back, low enough that only she could hear. "Aggressive, coordinated, no weapons visible yet. Could be more." Sarah nodded once. Her pulse thudded hard in her ears, but she forced her breathing into rhythm. Assess first, act second. She pushed to her feet, every muscle stiff from sleep but surging with purpose now. Her voice carried with the unmistakable cadence of command. "Everyone stay calm," she called out, loud enough to slice through the chaos but measured enough to project authority. Dozens of heads snapped toward her. The passengers didn't know who she was, but the tone was unmistakable. People listened when someone spoke like that. She crouched briefly by the injured attendant. "You'll be okay," Sarah assured her. Then checked the wrist. Swollen, likely sprained but not broken. She squeezed the woman's hand. "Stay low. You're safe." Jack had already risen beside her, his frame a wall of coiled muscle ready to strike. "You lead, I'll execute," he muttered. Sarah didn't question it. She knew his type instantly, the discipline in his posture, the predator's patience in his stance. SEAL, warrior, reliable. She gave him the faintest nod. The hijackers at the door shouted again, fists hammering the metal. One turned and barked something at the passengers, his face twisted in rage. Sarah stood taller, locking her eyes on him. For a moment he faltered, confused by the sudden presence of a woman standing firm when everyone else shrank away. "Sit down," he barked, gesturing wildly. But Sarah didn't sit. She didn't move. Her stillness was deliberate. Her defiance, absolute. She knew fear was fuel to men like this, and she refused to feed it. She turned her head slightly toward Jack, her lips barely moving. "We hold them here. Secure the cabin. By the cockpit time." His reply was a faint grin, not of humor but recognition. He had spent his life fighting alongside people who could stay calm in storms. Now, here was another. Sarah reached for the interphone mounted by the galley. With a swift motion, she pressed the button and spoke to the pilots behind the sealed door. Her voice was crisp, all business. "Hijack attempt in progress. 2 assailants at cockpit. Cabin contained, crew assisting. Divert if possible. Will maintain order until further notice." Her words steadied the crew and passengers alike. Someone was in charge now. Someone wasn't afraid. As she hung up the receiver, Sarah pivoted back toward Jack, her jaw set. She had been asleep only minutes ago, but those minutes were gone, erased by the reality that had exploded around her. The woman who had slumped, exhausted, in seat 8A no longer existed. Captain Sarah Monroe, the pilot, the soldier, the leader, had taken her place. For a heartbeat, the cabin was chaos. People muttered prayers, children whimpered into their parents' arms, and the hijackers pounded on the cockpit door like drumbeats of fear. But then Sarah Monroe's voice rose above it all, steady and commanding, cutting through the storm like a flare in darkness. Everyone stay calm, eyes forward, nobody move unless I tell you to. The words rang with authority, not desperation. Something shifted in the air. Passengers who had been frozen with panic now stared at her, clinging to the steadiness in her tone. She didn't look like a civilian anymore, she looked like someone in charge. Jack Riley stood shoulder to shoulder with her, his imposing frame anchoring the aisle. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. Together, they projected something stronger than fear, control. The hijackers turned, startled by the sudden opposition. One snarled, shouting at the cabin in broken English. "Sit quiet." His wild gestures made passengers flinch. But Sarah didn't flinch. She locked eyes with him, her jaw firm. Jack leaned close, his voice low but urgent. "We can't let them gain momentum. If they break into the cockpit, it's over." Sarah gave a single nod. She knew the stakes as well as he did. "We hold them here," she whispered. Her eyes swept the cabin, calculating. The beverage cart was halfway down the aisle, abandoned when panic hit. Perfect. She motioned to two men seated nearby, both strong-looking, one in a construction jacket, the other with a firefighter's calm posture. "You two," she called. "Help me move that cart forward. Block this aisle now." They blinked in surprise but obeyed, galvanized by her certainty. Together they shoved the heavy cart into position, wedging it across the narrow space like a barricade. The hijackers shouted, furious, but their path was sealed. Jack took his cue. He surged forward with sudden speed, catching the nearest attacker off guard. In one fluid motion, he slammed the man against the bulkhead, his arm twisting behind him in a lock that made bone and sinew strain. The attacker cried out, but Jack's grip was iron. The second man lunged, but Sarah stepped between him and the passengers, raising her voice. "Stay back!" Her tone cracked like a whip. Behind her, two younger passengers, college kids with wide, terrified eyes, rose instinctively, emboldened by her defiance. They grabbed the nearest loose objects, a laptop bag, a backpack, and used them as shields, forcing the hijacker to hesitate. "Keep pressure here," Sarah barked, pointing them into place. The kids nodded, adrenaline flooding their veins. Jack wrestled his captive down the aisle, slamming him onto the floor. The man thrashed, but Jack's training made the struggle short-lived. In seconds, he had the attacker pinned, one knee pressing his spine, his arms locked behind him. "Something to tie him," Jack demanded, his voice calm despite the fury in his grip. Without hesitation, Sarah turned to the nearest passenger. "Your belt, now." A businessman fumbled, but yanked off his leather belt and handed it over. Jack looped it around the man's wrists, pulling tight until his struggles slowed to futile jerks. Meanwhile, the second attacker tried to rally, shouting angrily to his partner, but his words fell flat against the united wall of resistance. Passengers who moments ago had been sheepish and frozen were now standing taller, encouraged by Sarah and Jack. The hijackers' intimidation had lost its grip. Sarah stood firm, her gaze sweeping the rows. "Everyone breathe. Stay seated. Stay quiet. Help is coming, but we hold together until then." Her calm confidence rippled outward and people obeyed, clinging to her words like a lifeline. Jack glanced up at her, still holding the subdued man to the floor. Sweat glistened on his brow, but his grin was sharp and approving. "You're a natural at this," he said. She shot him a quick look, equal parts focus and dry humor. "I don't do natural, I do training." Their eyes met briefly. Two soldiers, different branches, same fight. For a moment there was unspoken recognition, a silent pact. They would not let this plane fall. The hijacker at the cockpit door pounded again, desperate and furious. But this time he wasn't facing a cabin of helpless passengers. He was facing Sarah Monroe, wide awake in 8A, and Jack Riley, a Navy SEAL who'd decided to stand his ground. And for the first time, the attackers weren't in control. The cabin was no longer silent. The air vibrated with shouts, cries, and the thud of fists against reinforced metal. Fear was still there, coiling in every seat, but it had changed shape. Where once it had paralyzed, now it sharpened, driven by the example of two people who refused to bow. Jack Riley's knee pinned one hijacker to the carpet, his hand cinched tight with a leather belt. The man snarled and twisted, but Jack's grip was immovable. He didn't waste breath taunting or shouting. He simply controlled, methodical and precise, like he had hundreds of times in combat zones. The second hijacker wasn't subdued. Not yet. He charged down the aisle, fury spilling from his face, his fists raised. He was younger, stronger looking, his body fueled by rage. Passengers shrank back instinctively, some shielding their faces, but Sarah Monroe didn't flinch. "Now!" she snapped. Two passengers, the college kids who had already shown courage, hurled their improvised weapons. A backpack struck the hijacker's chest. A laptop bag slammed into his shoulder. It wasn't enough to stop him, but it slowed him, staggered his rhythm. And that half-second was all Jack needed. Releasing his hold on the subdued attacker only long enough to shift, Jack lunged up with soldier's speed. He met the charging man mid-aisle, shoulder slamming into his chest like a battering ram. The impact sent both men crashing against a row of seats, jolting the passengers inside, who yelped in surprise but quickly scrambled out of the way. The hijacker swung wildly, catching Jack across the jaw. Pain flared, but Jack didn't falter. He blocked the next strike, countering with a crushing elbow to the ribs. The hijacker wheezed, doubling over, and Jack followed with a sweep that sent him sprawling onto the carpet. "Help me hold him," Sarah barked. A construction worker and the firefighter she'd recruited earlier sprang forward, tackling the writhing man alongside Jack. Together they forced his arms behind his back, pinning him face first against the floor. Another passenger stripped off his belt, handing it over. Within moments, both hijackers were restrained, their shouts muffled beneath the heavy breathing of the men who held them down. The passengers erupted into a strange chorus, part relieved, cheers, part sobbing. The energy in the cabin shifted again. They weren't just victims anymore, they were survivors fighting back. Sarah raised both hands, commanding attention. "Listen to me, stay seated, stay calm. These men are not getting this plane, do you understand me?" A chorus of shaky voices answered, "Yes." She nodded once, satisfied, then moved swiftly down the aisle, crouching beside frightened families, reassuring elderly passengers and checking on the injured attendant near the galley. Her presence steadied them. She wasn't just speaking, and she was leading. Jack, catching his breath, wiped blood from the corner of his lip where the hijacker's punch had landed. He shot Sarah a look, a faint grin breaking through the grit. "You've got a hell of a command voice." She smirked back, brief but sharp. "And you've got a hell of a right hook." Their exchange was short-lived. A ripple of unease spread through the cabin as the restrained men continued shouting, in their own language, thrashing against their bonds. Passengers tensed again. Sarah knelt beside them, her voice low but cutting. "You're done. This plane isn't yours." Her tone carried such certainty that even bound, they seemed smaller, their fury powerless against her calm defiance. Then she rose, turned to Jack. "Cockpit's still sealed. We need confirmation. They'll divert." Jack nodded, scanning the aisle one last time to ensure no other threats lurked. "You handle the pilots. I'll keep these two on the floor." As Sarah strode to the interphone, passengers' eyes followed her, their fear tempered by awe. They had watched her wake from sleep in 8A as just another passenger, and now she was commanding the cabin like she'd been born to it. Behind her, Jack knelt over the restrained men, every muscle taut, his body language a promise. If they tried to rise, he would crush them again. At 30,000 feet in the heart of the night, the battle had been fought and, for now, won. But both Sarah and Jack knew it wasn't over. Not until the wheels hit the ground, and that meant the hardest part was still ahead, keeping everyone calm, alive, and steady for the descent. The reinforced cockpit door held firm, but every second stretched thin like a taut wire. Sarah Monroe's hand hovered over the interphone, her mind calculating, measuring risk with a precision that only a pilot could possess. Jack Riley kept, his gaze locked on the two restrained hijackers, muscles coiled, ready to act if they thrashed or broke free. "Cockpit still sealed," Sarah reported, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. We need to divert. St. Louis is our closest airport for emergency landing. The flight crew's relief was palpable over the interphone. Acknowledged, the captain replied. Prepare for descent. Law enforcement will meet us. Sarah exhaled briefly, but there was no time for celebration. She scanned the cabin. Passengers were tense, gripping armrests, eyes darting between the restrained men and the calm authority she projected. Even fear, she knew, could spread faster than panic, and the last thing they needed was chaos during descent. Jack shifted, slightly, tightening the belts around the attacker's wrists. One man spat, muttering angry words in a language none of the passengers understood. Jack didn't flinch. He leaned in, his expression a mask of controlled intensity. Quiet. You're done, he muttered, voice low, deadly. Beside him, Sarah moved quickly, crouching near families with small children. She whispered instructions, in calm, clipped sentences. Stay seated. Keep your seatbelts fastened. No sudden movements. We're going to land safely. Her tone had a strange effect. Panic softened into wary compliance. The passengers began to trust that someone was truly in control. The plane shuddered slightly as the pilots began descending, and Sarah felt the familiar hum of altitude change beneath her feet. She moved to the aisle, checking the restrained men again. Jack followed her, keeping a silent, watchful eye on the cabin. Keep them calm, Sarah said. Passengers need reassurance. She spoke directly to the nearest fearful passengers. I know this is frightening, she said, voice firm but soothing, but you are safe. You're following instructions. These men can't harm us, trust me, trust the crew. A few nodded, blinking rapidly. Some whispered prayers. Even those who had tried to resist the calm authority of the flight now leaned into it, letting her presence guide them. Jack crouched over the hijackers, checking for movement. One of them had begun to squirm slightly, anger flashing in his eyes. Jack pressed his knee a little harder, reminding him of the futility of resistance. The man's shouting subsided into muttered curses. Sarah returned to the interphone. Cabin secured. 2 assailants restrained. Passengers and crew are calm. Prepare for landing. The pilots acknowledged her with gratitude, a tension in their voices giving way to relief. You've done an excellent job keeping order, one said. She allowed herself a brief nod, then moved back down the aisle, making eye contact with Jack. Ready? She asked. Always, he replied, not a hint of exhaustion showing on his face. As the plane descended, the city lights of St. Louis came into view, sparkling against the night like a promise of safety. Sarah walked the aisle once more, giving quick reassurance, scanning for loose items, checking every passenger's posture. Every detail mattered. Even a single panicked movement could spark chaos. Jack kept a hand near the restrained men, ensuring they couldn't move as the plane's speed adjusted for final approach. Sweat gleamed on his brow, but his focus never wavered. He and Sarah had transformed the cabin from a scene of terror into one of controlled coordination. Finally, with a smooth descent, the plane touched down. Emergency vehicles swarmed the runway, their red and blue lights reflecting through the windows. The passengers erupted quietly into cheers and relieved murmurs. Sarah allowed herself a rare exhale. Jack released his restrained hold only slightly, still ready if needed, but the immediate threat had passed. The aircraft rolled to a stop. Doors opened, law enforcement rushed in, and the hijackers were quickly escorted away. Sarah and Jack remained standing side by side, exhausted but unshaken, watching as the chaos finally gave way to order. For the first time in hours, the cabin felt like a safe place, but both knew this flight, the terror, the adrenaline, the fight, would never truly leave the passengers' memories. Sarah finally leaned back, letting herself relax, a tired smile flickering at the corners of her lips. Jack met her gaze, nodding faintly, a silent acknowledgement of a battle fought and won at 30,000 feet. The flight had landed, but the story of 8A, of courage, leadership, and survival, had only just begun. The morning sun was barely a pale smear over the horizon as the plane taxied toward the gate at St. Louis International Airport. Emergency. Vehicles lined the runway, their red and blue lights reflecting across the fuselage in a rhythm like a heartbeat. Inside, the cabin buzzed with relief and disbelief. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, murmuring, exchanging looks of gratitude and shock. Many had tears in their eyes. Some whispered prayers of thanks, and a few clutched children close as though trying to convey the gravity of the night in simple comfort. Sarah Monroe stayed standing near 8A, her body still alert despite exhaustion, clawing at every muscle. She scanned the cabin quietly, ensuring everyone was steady. The restrained hijackers had been securely bound by law enforcement as the doors opened and officers began guiding them away. Their angry shouts had faded into muffled words lost to the hum of the terminal. Jack Riley remained at her side, a quiet sentinel even now. His hands rested lightly on the belt securing the attackers, but his eyes roamed the cabin, still assessing, still watching for danger. The tension that had gripped his muscles for hours was slowly releasing, replaced by the rare and fleeting calm that follows the storm. "Everyone okay?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and measured. A flight attendant stepped forward, nodding vigorously. "Thanks to you, Captain, we managed to maintain order. Everyone followed instructions." Jack chuckled softly, leaning slightly toward Sarah. "Not just me," he said. "You woke up and took over like you were born for it." She shook, her head a tired smile forming. "I was just in 8A trying to get some sleep," she replied, the hint of dry humor breaking through her fatigue. Passengers began to gather, hesitantly approaching the two. A mother held her child's hand, her voice quivering. "Thank you. You saved us all." A businessman extended a hand, eyes wide with awe. "I don't know how to express my gratitude. You kept everyone alive." Sarah nodded politely, deflecting the praise. "We all stayed calm. That's what saved us. Courage isn't just one person. It's everyone doing what's right under pressure." Jack smiled faintly. "And sometimes it helps to have someone with a loud voice in 8A. A small laugh rippled through the passengers. Even the children seemed to sense that the immediate danger was gone. Cameras from news crews outside began arriving, capturing the chaos's aftermath. But Sarah and Jack remained focused on the people around them, rather than the flashing lights. Authorities guided everyone off the plane, and the passengers filed into the terminal in small organized groups. Sarah and Jack walked slowly behind them, making sure no one stumbled or panicked during the disembarkation. Outside, the sun was rising fully now, painting the airport in golden light. The adrenaline from the night still surged in Sarah's veins, but it was tempered with exhaustion. Jack glanced at her, his expression softer than it had been in hours. "We did good," he said simply. Sarah nodded, letting herself exhale. At last, "Yeah, we did." For the passengers, the flight would never be ordinary again. They would tell the story over and over. The plane at 30,000 feet, the hijackers at the cockpit, and the woman who had been asleep in 8A, who woke, led, and saved them all. Jack and Sarah stepped outside together, watching as emergency personnel guided the hijackers into vehicles. A faint breeze ruffled Sarah's hair, carrying the quiet promise of a normal life returning. For now, though, they allowed themselves to simply stand and watch, sharing the silent satisfaction of a mission completed without orders, medals, or recognition. A mission defined solely by courage and human resolve. Sarah glanced at Jack. "Coffee?" she asked, voice soft but teasing. He smirked. "Only if it comes with quiet this time." For the first time in hours, they laughed together. Around them, the city moved on, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded in the sky above. But for everyone on that flight, the story of Seat 8A, of vigilance, courage, and quick thinking, would live forever. And in that fleeting moment, high above the chaos of ordinary life, two warriors allowed themselves a rare, quiet victory.